A home is not four walls, but the hands that hold you there. The wind had been her only companion for 3 days, a relentless thief that stole warmth from her bones and scattered dust in her eyes. It was a cruel, indifferent force, sweeping across the plains with nothing to stop it, just as the world had swept over her, leaving her with nothing but a small, tired boy and the clothes on her back. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp that the wind snatched away before it could properly form. She tried again, louder this time, directing the words at the silent figure on the porch of the distant, solitary cabin. "Please, just a little water. For my boy." The man did not move. He sat in a high-backed wooden chair, a shape of stillness against the vast, moving landscape. He was a part of the prairie, weathered and unyielding. From this distance, she couldn't see his face, only the broad set of his shoulders and the dark brim of his hat, pulled low. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the dust-laden air. It was a silence she knew well, the kind that came after a question was asked and the answer was already no. Her shoulders sagged, the weight of her son, Leo, a familiar ache in her arms. He was asleep, his small face lax with exhaustion, his cheek pressed against her collarbone. She had failed him again. She was about to turn, to force her feet back onto the endless ribbon of dirt road that led to nowhere she wanted to go, when the man finally moved. It was not a sudden motion, but a slow, deliberate unfolding, as if he were waking from a long slumber. He rose from the chair, walked to the edge of the porch and stood there watching them. The space between them felt a mile wide, a chasm of distrust and weariness. He was judging her, she knew, measuring her desperation. She met his unseen gaze with what little dignity she had left, her chin held steady. He turned without a word and disappeared into the dark interior of the cabin. A moment later, he returned with a tin dipper. He didn't come down the steps. He didn't approach her. He walked to the rain barrel at the corner of the porch, dipped it full, and set it on the top step. Then he raised a hand and pointed a single, definitive finger toward the squat, gray structure of the barn that stood 100 yards away. It was an instruction, not an invitation. Water, shelter. He had offered both without speaking a single word. It was more than anyone else had offered in weeks. For a long moment, Alara stood frozen, the wind whipping her thin skirt around her legs. To accept was to be indebted. To be indebted was to be vulnerable. But then Leo stirred in her arms, a soft, feverish sigh, and the choice was no longer hers to make. She walked toward the porch, her boots sinking into the soft dust. She did not look at the man as she picked up the dipper, her hand trembling slightly. The water was cool and tasted of wood and sky. She drank first, a deep, shuddering swallow, before gently waking her son. Leo drank greedily, water dribbling down his chin. When he was finished, he looked past his mother's shoulder at the silent man on the porch, his eyes wide with a child's unfiltered curiosity. The man just stood there, his face still a mystery of shadow. Alara set the empty dipper back on the step. She gave the man a short, sharp nod, a gesture of transaction, not gratitude. Then she turned and walked toward the barn, her back straight, every step a declaration that she was a survivor, not a beggar. The heavy barn door groaned as she pushed it open, revealing an interior of deep, cool shadows that smelled of hay and earth and animals long gone. It was a place to rest. It was enough. The narrator of this quiet moment could only guess at the man's thoughts, but perhaps, in the woman's weary stride and the child's trusting eyes, he saw a ghost of a chance for something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to care. He offered her the old line shack, a small, weathered box of a building that sat behind the main cabin, half hidden by a stand of stubborn cottonwoods. It wasn't much. The floorboards were uneven, and the wind found its way through a dozen small cracks in the walls. But it had a roof that looked mostly sound, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot. It was a shelter, separate and contained, a place where she could maintain the illusion of independence. "You can work for your keep," he said. His voice was like his movements, slow and deliberate, a low rumble that seemed unused to forming words. He stood in the doorway of the shack, blocking most of the afternoon light, his large frame filling the space. Mending, cooking. The house is neglected. Alara stood in the center of the single room, her arms wrapped around herself. Leo was asleep on the cot, a small, still lump under her worn shawl. She looked at the man, Silas, as he had introduced himself, and saw the caution in his eyes mirrored her own. His face was weathered, carved with lines that spoke of sun and wind and sorrow. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they didn't quite meet hers, focusing instead on a point just over her shoulder. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and this intrusion was a disruption he was still measuring. "I have no money to pay you for supplies," she stated flatly. It was not an apology, but a fact. She would not begin this arrangement with a debt she couldn't settle. "I have flour and beans, a side of bacon. There's a garden, what's left of it." He gestured vaguely toward the back of his cabin. "You cook, we eat. That's the arrangement." She considered this. It was a fair trade. It was work. It gave her purpose, a role beyond that of a desperate mother clutching her child. It allowed her to earn her place, which was a thing of profound importance. Pride was a thin coat in a blizzard, but sometimes it was the only one you had. She looked around the shack again. It was empty, a blank space waiting to be filled with the small routines of life. It felt safe in its emptiness. There were no memories here, no ghosts of a life that had been snatched away. "And the boy?" she asked, her voice softening as she glanced at Leo. Silas followed her gaze. For a flicker of a second, something shifted in his expression. A deep, ancient pain that was gone as quickly as it appeared. "He's no trouble." She nodded slowly. "All right." He accepted her answer with a slight dip of his chin, then turned and left, leaving her alone in the quiet shack. The silence he left behind was different from the silence of the plains. It was a silence of possibility, of a temporary truce with the harshness of the world. Alara walked to the single, grimy window and watched him cross the yard to his own cabin. He moved like a man who carried a great weight, not in his arms, but on his soul. He didn't look back. She knew this was not a home. It was a stop, a place to gather strength before moving on. She could not afford to trust this man's quiet generosity. Men were rarely generous without expecting something in return, something she was no longer willing or able to give. She would work hard, keep to herself, and save what little energy she had for her son. She would be like a desert animal, taking what she needed from this small oasis and leaving no trace of herself behind when it was time to go. That evening, she found a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a slab of salt pork on the shack's small porch. Beside it was a neatly stacked pile of firewood. There was no note. There were no words. Just the simple, practical language of provision. She cooked a simple meal of fried pork and skillet bread over the fire. After she and Leo had eaten, she filled a plate for Silas, covered it with a piece of clean cloth, and walked the 30 yards to his cabin. She hesitated at the steps, listening to the profound silence within. She set the plate on the porch railing, knocked once, softly, on the wooden post, and retreated back to her own small world before he could answer. It was a transaction, nothing more. She would hold that truth close, a shield against the dangerous warmth of hope. The days fell into a pattern, a silent rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Time was measured not in hours, but in tasks completed. Alara rose before dawn, the air cool and tasting of sage. She would build her fire, put the coffee on to boil, and watch the eastern sky bleed from gray to pale rose. Silas was already gone by then. She would see his horse, a dark shape moving toward the distant pastures, a solitary man shrinking into a vast landscape. His absence was a tangible thing, leaving the small homestead in her and Leo's care. Her world was the line shack, the main cabin, the chicken coop, and the struggling garden. She swept the floors of his house, a place that felt more like a museum than a home. It was sparse, meticulously clean in some areas, and layered with the dust of neglect in others. A single photograph sat on the mantelpiece, a faded image of a woman with a kind smile and a small child on her lap. Alara never looked at it for long. It was not her story to know. She cleaned around it, her cloth carefully avoiding the silver frame, granting the memory its privacy. She washed his clothes, the heavy denim and canvas smelling of horse and sweat and earth. She mended the tears with small, neat stitches, a craft learned in another life. She gathered the few eggs the scrawny hens laid and coaxed withered vegetables from the dry soil of the garden. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong. She felt herself hardening, becoming as weathered and practical as the land around her. Leo, after days of silent observation, began to explore. He was a quiet boy, made old by hardship, but the security of a full belly and a roof over his head began to coax the child back to the surface. He would spend hours chasing grasshoppers in the tall grass or drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. He never went far. His world was defined by the invisible circle he drew around his mother. Theirs was a life of silent exchange. In the morning, she would find a bucket of fresh milk or a newly cut pile of kindling by her door. In the evening, she would leave his supper on the porch railing. They rarely saw each other, and when they did, it was at a distance. A nod across the yard, a shared glance at the horizon as they watched a storm roll in. They orbited each other like two solitary planets, held in place by a shared, unspoken gravity of need and circumstance. Trust did not grow in this silence. It was too barren a soil, but a kind of understanding began to take root. She learned the sound of his horse's gait, could tell he was coming home long before he appeared over the rise. He, in turn, seemed to know when she was low on flour or when the woodpile was shrinking. The needed item would simply appear, without request or comment. One afternoon, as she was kneading dough, she watched him from her window. He was at the water pump, working the handle with a steady, rhythmic motion. He drank from the old, dented tin cup he always used, the one he kept hanging from a nail on the pump's wooden frame. After he drank, he didn't just dump the rest of the water. He walked over to the wilting tomato plants she had been trying to revive and poured the remaining water carefully at their roots. It was a small gesture, almost invisible. He probably didn't even know she was watching. But for Alara, it was a crack in the stoic facade. It was an act of quiet care, an acknowledgement of her effort. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was something quieter, something that existed in the space between strangers. It was a shared investment in this small patch of earth. She turned back to her dough, her movements a little softer, her heart a little less guarded than it had been when the sun rose that morning. The language of this place was action, not words. Alara learned to read it in the small, deliberate changes to her environment. One morning, the loose board on her porch step, the one that groaned a complaint every time she stepped on it, was suddenly firm and silent beneath her foot. She knelt and saw the gleam of two new, perfectly aligned nails securing it to the joist. She had not asked. She had not mentioned it. He had simply noticed, and in the quiet of the night or the early dawn, he had fixed it. A week later, the persistent squeak of her shack's door hinge vanished. The sound had been a constant, irritating companion, a small misery she had learned to tolerate. One morning, it was gone, replaced by a smooth, silent swing. When she examined it, she saw the dark gleam of fresh grease worked carefully into the joint. He had moved through her space like a ghost, leaving only repairs in his wake. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet, steady work of a man who knew how to maintain things, how to stop the slow, inevitable creep of decay. But to Alara, they felt like more. Each silent repair was a brick laid in a wall of security she hadn't realized was being built around her. It was a form of communication more honest than any promise. Promise could be broken. A mended step was a solid fact. As the days grew shorter and a chill began to lace the morning air, she noticed him watching the sky more often. He would stand on his porch after his supper, his gaze fixed on the western horizon, reading the clouds, smelling the wind. He was preparing for winter. He spent his days reinforcing the corral, checking the roof of the barn, and cutting and splitting a mountain of firewood that grew larger each day. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat now, a formidable shield against the biting wind. The coat was old, the leather cracked and scarred, the wool collar worn smooth with age. It seemed an extension of the man himself, durable, weathered, and built to withstand the harshest elements. It was the coat of a man who expected nothing but hardship from the world and was prepared to meet it head-on. One afternoon, a cold, driving rain began to fall. It was the first real storm of the season. Leo was playing on the floor of the shack, lining up pebbles in a neat row. Suddenly, a drip of water landed on the back of his hand. He looked up, his eyes wide. Another drop fell, then another, landing on the wooden floor with a soft, insistent patter. Alara looked up at the ceiling and saw a dark, spreading stain. The roof had a leak. She placed a bucket underneath it, the steady plink-plunk of the drops a grim rhythm marking the storm's intrusion. It was a small thing, but it felt like a major breach. The shack was her one safe place, and it was failing. She felt a familiar despair begin to curl in her stomach. The rain continued all night. The next morning, the sky was a clean, scrubbed gray. The world was damp and smelled of wet earth. When Alara stepped outside, the first thing she saw was a ladder leaning against the side of her shack. Silas was already on the roof. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, his hammer blows echoing in the crisp morning air. He didn't look down at her. He just worked, replacing the worn shingles, his focus absolute. She went inside and put the coffee on. When it was ready, she poured a steaming mug and carried it out. She stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up. "I made coffee," she said, her voice small in the vast, quiet morning. He stopped hammering and looked down at her. His face was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. For a long moment he just watched her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Then slowly he nodded. He came down the ladder, his boots making soft thuds on each rung. He took the mug from her hand, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was like a spark of warmth against the cold morning. He didn't thank her. He just stood there, leaning against the ladder, and drank the coffee, his gaze on the horizon. And she stood there with him, not speaking, just sharing the quiet space. The storm had passed. A repair was being made. It was enough. The storm that mattered came from within. It arrived not with thunder and lightning, but with a dry, rasping cough in the middle of the night. Alara sat up on her cot, her heart instantly alert. The sound came again, small and weak, from the makeshift bed she'd made for Leo by the hearth. In the dim firelight, she could see his small body was rigid, his breathing shallow and fast. She pressed her palm to his forehead. It was burning. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the weary calm she had cultivated. Out here, miles from any town or doctor, a fever was not just an illness. It was a mortal enemy. The wind howled outside, rattling the shack's single window, a monstrous voice mocking her isolation. The rain, which had started again at dusk, lashed against the roof in relentless sheets. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She spent the next hour in a frantic, useless cycle of activity. She bathed Leo's face with a cool, damp cloth. She tried to coax a few sips of water between his dry, cracked lips. She piled her own thin blanket on top of him, then took it off, worried he was too hot. The fever did not recede. It tightened its grip, stealing the life from his cheeks, leaving them flushed and glassy. His coughs grew harsher, tearing at his small frame. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there, holding his limp hand, when a heavy knock sounded at the door. It was so loud and sudden it felt like a physical blow. She froze. No one ever came to her door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Ma'am." Silas's voice, muffled by the door and the storm. She couldn't bring herself to answer. What could she say? How could she admit to this new, catastrophic failure? The door creaked open. He stood on the threshold, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his heavy sheepskin coat slick and dark with water. He filled the doorway, a bulwark against the raging storm behind him. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, found her immediately, huddled by the fire. Then they moved to the small, still form of her son. He didn't need to ask. He saw the truth of the situation in the panic on her face and the labored sound of the boy's breathing. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Alara braced herself for him to leave, to retreat back to his own dry, safe world, leaving her to face this horror alone. It was what she expected. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him, shutting out the storm. He took off his hat, then his heavy, wet coat, hanging it on a peg by the door as if he belonged there. He walked to the hearth and knelt beside Leo, his large, calloused hand gently touching the boy's forehead. He was so large and the boy so small, yet his touch was infinitely gentle. "There's willow bark in my cabin," he said, his voice low and calm, a steady anchor in her sea of fear. "It'll bring the fever down, and I have herbs for a poultice." For his chest. He didn't wait for her permission. He was already moving, his actions sure and purposeful. He stoked the fire, adding logs from the pile he had stacked on her porch until it blazed with a fierce, comforting heat. He handed her a small, dry sack. "Grind this. Add hot water to make a paste." While she fumbled with the herbs, her hands trembling, he went back out into the storm. He returned moments later with a tin of shredded bark and a small kettle. He moved around her small shack with a quiet competence that was profoundly reassuring. He brewed a bitter-smelling tea from the willow bark, cooled it with water from the bucket, and then, with a patience that stunned her, he gently lifted Leo's head and helped him sip the liquid. He showed her how to mix the poultice and spread it on a piece of cloth, which he then laid gently on Leo's congested chest. The room filled with the sharp, medicinal scent of eucalyptus and pine. And then, there was nothing left to do but wait. Silas pulled a simple wooden chair from the corner and sat down, a silent sentinel in the flickering firelight. He did not speak. He just sat, his presence a solid, unwavering certainty against the chaos of the night. Alara sank back onto her heels beside Leo, her energy completely spent. She had fought alone for so long, and now, suddenly, she was not. The relief was so immense it felt like a physical ache. She watched the man's shadowed profile, the set of his jaw, the quiet focus in his eyes as he watched the sleeping boy. He was not just offering shelter from the storm outside. He was offering shelter from the one within. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to lean on it. She stayed by her son's side, but her fear was no longer a solitary burden. He stayed. He stayed through the long, dark hours, and she let him. The fever broke just before dawn. It did not retreat with a dramatic flourish, but simply receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind a fragile peace. Leo's breathing eased, the harsh, ragged sound softening into a deep, even rhythm. The fierce heat beneath his skin cooled to a damp warmth. He was sleeping, truly sleeping, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The storm outside had exhausted itself as well, the wind's howl diminishing to a low moan, the rain softening to a gentle patter on the roof. Alara, who had not dared to close her eyes all night, felt the knot of terror in her chest finally begin to loosen. She laid a hand on Leo's forehead and found it cool. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Silas rose from his chair, his joints cracking softly in the quiet room. He had not slept. He had sat his vigil, a stoic, unmoving presence in the corner. He walked over and looked down at the boy, his expression still and unreadable in the gray morning light. He gave a single, slow nod of confirmation. Alara pushed herself to her feet, her body stiff and sore. She looked at this man who had barged into her life, into her crisis, and anchored it with his calm strength. The careful distance she had maintained between them had been washed away by the long, desperate night. "Thank you," she said. The words were small, inadequate, but they were all she had. They were the first crack in her armor of self-reliance. He didn't dismiss her thanks with a shrug or a platitude. He just met her eyes, really met them for the first time, and held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. In the depths of his pale blue eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and weary understanding. He knew what it was to be afraid for someone you loved. He knew the shape of loss. She turned to the hearth and reached for the coffee pot. Her hands were steady now. "I'll make coffee." It was an offering, a gesture of shared survival. He didn't refuse. He didn't retreat to his own cabin. He sat at her small, rough-hewn table, a giant in the tiny space, and waited. She moved around him, her actions reclaiming the familiar rhythm of her morning routine, but everything felt different. The space was no longer just hers. It was shared. She placed a steaming mug in front of him. He wrapped his large hands around it, letting the warmth seep into his skin. They drank in silence, but it was a new kind of silence. It was not the empty silence of strangers, but the full, companionable quiet of two people who had weathered a storm together. As she sipped her coffee, her gaze fell on his hands. They were scarred and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, but they had been so gentle with her son. An image surfaced in her mind, unbidden. Her husband's hands, equally strong, but always restless, always reaching for the next drink, the next gamble. They were not steady hands. They were not hands you could rely on to hold you in a storm. "His father," she began, her voice barely a whisper, and then stopped. She didn't know why she was speaking, why she was offering this piece of herself to this quiet man. But the shared vulnerability of the night had opened a door she thought was permanently closed. He wasn't a man for fevers, or for staying. Silas didn't respond with words. He simply looked down into his coffee cup, his expression tightening for a moment. He knew what it was to not be there when you were needed most. His gaze drifted to the wall, to a place where a memory hung, invisible to her. Later that day, after he had checked on his livestock and she had spooned some warm broth into Leo, Silas returned. He was carrying a small, wooden rocking chair. It was beautifully made, the wood worn to a soft, smooth patina by years of use. It was the chair from his own porch. "For you," he said, his voice gruff, as if embarrassed by the gesture. "And the boy. It's easier to rest in a rocker." He set it down near the fire, in the exact spot where she had spent most of the night huddled on the hard floor. He didn't wait for her to thank him. He just nodded and left, leaving the chair behind. It was a piece of his home, now sitting in hers. It was an offering of comfort, a silent acknowledgement of her exhaustion. That evening, as Leo slept soundly in his cot, Alara sat in the rocking chair, its gentle rhythmic creak a soothing lullaby in the quiet shack. It was the first time in years she had felt something even close to peace. The crisis had passed, and in its wake, something new and fragile had begun to grow. The weeks that followed were filled with the soft, quiet work of healing. Leo regained his strength, his laughter slowly returning, a sound that seemed to chase the last of the shadows from the corners of the shack. The first time he laughed, a full-bodied, genuine peal of joy while chasing a stray kitten near the barn, Alara saw Silas pause in his work, his head tilted as if listening to a long-forgotten song. A faint, sad smile touched his lips before he turned back to mending a fence. The invisible wall between the two cabins dissolved. Silas began to take his evening meal with them at the small table in the shack. The first time he'd appeared at the door, holding his empty plate, a silent, almost awkward question in his eyes. Alara had simply nodded and gestured to the empty chair. The meals were quiet affairs. Leo did most of the talking, chattering about his day, the shape of a cloud, the color of a beetle he'd found. Alara and Silas would listen, exchanging occasional glances over the boy's head. In these shared looks, a conversation was taking place, one of mutual respect and a slowly dawning affection. They began to share stories, not in long narratives, but in brief, broken fragments, like shards of pottery from a former life. One evening, while watching the fire, he spoke the name she had seen in his eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick, "my wife. And our girl, Lily." He didn't say more, but he didn't have to. The words hung in the air, explaining the empty spaces in his house and the deep-seated sorrow he carried. He had lost his family. A fever, he said later. One he couldn't stop. The guilt was a shadow he lived with every day. Alara, in turn, spoke of her husband, a good man with a restless heart, whose search for a better life had led them from one failed venture to another, until a mining accident had left her a widow, indebted to a man who saw her only as a burden to be discarded. Her story was one of survival, of learning to rely on no one but herself because everyone else had always, eventually, left. One day, Leo drew a picture with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood. It was a child's simple, powerful art. A big, boxy figure, a smaller one with a triangle skirt, and a tiny one in the middle. The three figures were holding hands under a lopsided, smiling sun, with a square house behind them. He shyly presented it to Silas after supper. Silas took the piece of wood and stared at it for a long time. His throat worked, and he had to clear it before he could speak. "It's a good drawing, son," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. He didn't put it aside. He carried it with him back to his cabin. The next morning, when Alara went to sweep, she saw it propped on the mantelpiece, right beside the faded silver-framed photograph of Sarah and Lily. The two families, one lost to memory and one tentatively forming in the present, now stood side by side. The day came when they needed supplies. The flour was low, the coffee gone. It was a trip that could no longer be postponed. "We'll go to town tomorrow," Silas announced, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. The "we" was unspoken but clear. They would go together. The thought sent a shiver of anxiety through Alara. The ranch had become her entire world, a safe, self-contained universe. The town, with its prying eyes and sharp-edged judgments, was a place she had no desire to revisit. But she knew it was necessary. She packed a small bag with bread and cheese and dressed Leo in his cleanest, most mended shirt. The ride into town in Silas's wagon was mostly silent. Leo sat between them, a small, excited bundle of energy, pointing out hawks and distant mesas. For Alara and Silas, the journey was more fraught. They were leaving the quiet understanding of the ranch and entering a world that would not understand them. They were presenting themselves as a unit, a man, a woman, and a child, and they both knew what conclusions would be drawn. As they pulled onto the town's dusty main street, Alara felt the stares like physical things. Women paused in their shopping, their heads turning, their whispers following the wagon like a cloud of insects. Men standing outside the saloon stopped their conversations to watch them pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She felt her face flush and instinctively pulled Leo a little closer. Silas seemed oblivious, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his hands steady on the reins. But she saw the muscle ticking in his jaw. He was not oblivious, he was enduring. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. As he helped her and Leo down, a voice, slick with arrogance and malice, cut through the air. Well, look what the wind blew in. I thought this town was finally rid of you, Alara." Alara froze, her hand still on Silas's arm. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. The voice belonged to Barton, the wealthy rancher who had employed her husband. The man who had turned her and Leo out with nothing but a day's wages after the funeral, claiming her husband's death was his own foolish fault. He stepped in front of them, blocking their path. He was a large man, well-fed and dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the dusty street. His eyes, small and piggy, raked over her, then flickered to Silas with a dismissive sneer. "Found yourself another stray to take in, have you?" Barton said to Silas, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Be careful. This one comes with baggage." He gestured to Leo with a contemptuous flick of his fingers. Then his gaze returned to Alara, his smile turning cruel. "Still trading on pity to get by, I see. How much is this one paying for your services?" The insult, vile and public, struck Alara like a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs. The street fell silent, everyone stopping to watch the unfolding humiliation. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, condemning her. Her first instinct was to flee, to grab Leo and run, to disappear back into the anonymous safety of the plains. She took a half-step back, her hand tightening on her son's shoulder. But before she could turn, Silas moved. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped forward, placing himself squarely between her and Barton. He was not as tall as Barton, but he seemed to fill the entire street, his presence immense and unyielding. The easy confidence on Barton's face faltered as he looked into Silas's cold, quiet fury. "You'll not speak to her," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried an absolute authority that cut through the silence. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed past his limit. Barton scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" Her new protector. Silas's gaze didn't waver. He slowly, deliberately, reached back and took Alara's hand. His grip was firm, solid, a tether in the swirling vortex of her shame. It was a public claim, a declaration for all to see. He looked from Barton's sneering face to the watching crowd, and then his eyes settled on Alara. He saw the fear and humiliation in her eyes, the instinct to run. His grip on her hand tightened. "Her place is with me now," Silas stated, his voice ringing with the clarity of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. He held Barton's gaze for a second longer, a silent, final warning. Then, without another word, he turned his back on the man, still holding Alara's hand, and led her and Leo toward the door of the general store. He walked through the silent, parted crowd as if they were nothing but wheat stalks in a field. He had drawn a line in the dust of that street, and he had placed himself, and them, firmly on one side of it. The ride back to the ranch was steeped in a new and profound silence. It was not the quiet of caution or the quiet of companionship. It was the heavy, reverberating silence that follows a great and sudden noise. The echo of Silas's words, "Her place is with me now," hung in the air between them, changing everything. Alara sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, her hands clenched in her lap, replaying the scene in her mind. The sneer on Barton's face, the avid stares of the townsfolk, the shame that had threatened to swallow her whole. And then, the solid, grounding reality of Silas's hand closing around hers. He had not flinched. He had not hesitated. He had claimed her, not as a possession but as a person worthy of defense. He had stood for her. No one had ever stood for her like that. Silas kept his eyes on the road, the brim of his hat hiding his expression. But the rigidity in his shoulders had eased, replaced by a kind of settled calm. He had done something he had likely not done in years. He had acted publicly and decisively on behalf of another. He had stepped out of the shadows of his own grief and into the harsh light of the world to protect them. The act seemed to have settled something within him, quieting a long-held ghost. When the familiar shape of the cabin and barn appeared over the rise, Alara felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to tears. She was not returning to a temporary shelter, a place of transit. She was returning home. The public declaration on that dusty street had made it so. It had transformed the unspoken arrangement between them into a public bond. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop, and the familiar sounds of the homestead, the clucking of the hens, the sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods, welcomed them back. He helped her and Leo down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her elbow for a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. That evening, for the first time, she did not cook in the shack. She walked into Silas's cabin, a sack of new flour in her arms, and began to prepare supper in his kitchen. He watched her for a moment from the doorway, then nodded and went to sit in his chair by the hearth, cleaning a piece of tack. Felt natural, felt right. Leo, seemingly untouched by the tension of the day in town, was filled with a new, boundless energy. He explored every corner of Silas's cabin, his small hands tracing the patterns on the quilts, his voice filling the quiet spaces that had been silent for so long. After they ate, while Alara washed the dishes, Leo ran outside into the twilight. A moment later, a sound, clear and pure as a spring-fed creek, filled the evening air. It was the sound of Leo's laughter, a full, uninhibited, joyous sound as he chased fireflies in the growing dark. Silas, who was standing on the porch, turned to look at Alara. A genuine smile, the first she had ever seen, transformed his weathered face, erasing the lines of sorrow and leaving only a gentle, wondering warmth. The sound of the boy's laughter was the sound of life returning to this quiet, lonely place. It was the sound of a family beginning. The shack was no longer her shelter and the cabin his. They were two parts of a single home, and the space between them was now filled not with silence and distance, but with the happy, echoing sound of a child's delight. From the hard silence of survival came the soft quiet of belonging. The seasons turned, bleeding the last warmth from the autumn air and bringing the first hard frosts of winter. The rhythm of their life settled into a new, deeper pattern. The days were a shared labor, the evenings a shared peace. A man who had closed his heart against the world for years learned that its only true purpose was to open again. He had built walls of solitude to protect himself from more pain, only to discover that the pain was inside the walls with him, a constant, quiet companion. It was the arrival of the woman and the boy that had finally breached those walls, not with force, but with a persistent, gentle need that had reminded him of his own humanity. A woman who had learned to trust no one, whose life had been a series of departures and betrayals, found an unexpected strength in leaning on another. She had believed that resilience was a solitary act, a hardening of the self against the world. But she discovered a different kind of resilience in the steady presence of a good man, in the shared warmth of a hearth, in the simple, profound act of placing her hand in his. Her strength was not diminished by his, it was multiplied. Their evenings took on a comfortable, domestic ritual. After supper, Silas would sit on the porch, even as the air grew cold, mending a bridle or sharpening a tool, the familiar, repetitive motions a kind of meditation. Alara would sit in the wooden rocker he had given her, its gentle creaking a peaceful counterpoint to the chirping of crickets. She would mend their clothes, her needle moving with a steady, practiced grace, her thoughts no longer racing with fear for the future, but settled in the calm of the present. Inside, Leo would be asleep, his small body secure under a warm quilt, his dreams untroubled. Sometimes they would talk, their voices low in the gathering dark. They spoke of small things, the weather, the health of the livestock, a funny thing Leo had said. They were the simple, sturdy words that people use to build a life together. Other times, they would sit in a comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast, ink-black sky, two small figures finding their place in the universe, together. The creak of the rocker was the only sound, a quiet, rhythmic heartbeat for their new life. It was the sound of a home, finally truly found. Winter arrived in a whisper of white. One morning they awoke to a world transformed, blanketed in a thick, soundless layer of snow. The harsh lines of the landscape were softened, the world made clean and new. Inside the cabin, a fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the wooden walls. The air was filled with the scent of coffee and wood smoke. It was a pocket of warmth and life carved out of the vast, cold emptiness of the plains. Silas's heavy sheepskin coat, the one that had been his armor against the world, hung on a peg by the door. It was at rest. Its purpose as a shield was no longer primary. He was inside where it was warm and he was not alone. Its presence on the hook was a quiet symbol of his journey from a solitary man braving the elements to a man who had found a reason to come in from the cold. He stood by the window watching the snow fall, a tin cup of coffee held in his hands. He was no longer the haunted man Alara had first seen on the porch. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had softened. The weight on his shoulders seemed lighter. He was still a quiet man, his nature forged in solitude and sorrow, but his silence was no longer a wall. It was a space of peace, a quiet harbor. Alara came to stand beside him. She looked out at the snow-covered yard, at the line shack that had once been her entire world, now just a small, quiet outbuilding. She thought of the woman who had arrived there, desperate and hollowed out by fear. She barely recognized her. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his forearm. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with everything they had built together. The shared fear of a long night, the quiet understanding of routine, the fierce loyalty of a public stand, the gentle peace of 1,000 shared silences. He turned his head to look at her, and his pale blue eyes were clear and full of a quiet, steady love. He covered her hand with his own, his large, calloused fingers lacing through hers. They stood together, side by side, watching the snow fall, their hands clasped, their shoulders lightly touching. No words were needed. Everything that mattered was in that touch, in that shared, quiet moment. The fire cast 3 long shadows on the wall, and they stood together as one.